them. Basically all rigging is essentially putting in like a fake joint system or like a fake bone system into your character so that you can move it. The benefits of this, it's a little bit more work on the back end, but you can repose your character really easily. So if you're ever doing work for a client and they're like, oh, I hate that pose, it's like a 5-second fix. The other benefit of it, I don't know if you guys have ever fiddled around with like modeling, you know, something like a complex human in a pose. I've done it before, and the arms were like 3 feet different length from each other. It also looked terrible, just because I had no idea what I was doing. But like, it's really hard to get a symmetrical body, in my opinion, just with straight modeling. So if you start with a rig, you can model your character in T-pose like this, model with symmetry, so you only need to model like one hand, one side of the body basically, and then just pose him as you please. So to access rigging, I'm just going to show you how to move this creepy dude. You're actually going to need to go out of your modeling menu and into your rigging menu. Huzzah. So again, menus up here change. First thing you want to look at is under skeleton and create joints. Honestly, I usually just leave all the settings pretty much how they are. The only setting, if I'm going to play with one, that I really ever play with is this short bone radius. So this is just like what it looks like when you make joints. This like these little balls at the end of the joint here. This is basically what the short bone radius is controlling. So if I go back in and I set that to something like 0.2, you'll notice that they just show up really smaller. Functionally, in terms of how your rig works, this makes no difference at all. It just makes it a little bit easier to look at, especially like if I was doing something like fingers where I have a lot of joints close to each other. On this particular model, these are going to be huge and almost impossible to select the correct one when I'm doing things. So again, short bone radius, usually the only thing I actually pay attention to. In terms of how skeletons actually work, so by default, they are going to be drawn like just directly on the grid in whichever plane you're working on. So in perspective mode, it's just going to draw it pretty much on the default little Maya grid. If you're working in a side view, it's just going to draw it pretty much straight back on that plane. So you can see it's just like at a 90-degree angle right along this axis here. So you'll need, if you need them to be in like a weird like curvy shape or something like that, you'll need to go back in and move them later. Any questions on this so far? Cool. All right, so in terms of getting this dude, or like, I guess how the joints actually work before I get like super crazy into stuff. So when I add these into my outliner, or when I add this into my scene, you'll notice that this is like the little icon for them. It's pretty much looks like a little purple elbow. And if I expand that, it shows all of my joints nested under each other in all their glory. And basically, so if I take joint 1, they basically work off parenting. So if I take joint 1, everything else that's parented under it is going to move with it. Same thing, grab joint 3, it's going to move everything that is parented beneath joint 3. So say I wanted to maybe take joint 4 and like chop this out of my joint chain. What I can do is actually I'm just going to middle mouse button drag this just out so it's not under joint 1 anymore. And I'm going to, actually, no, I'm not really going to do anything with that. So you can see that as soon as I've done that, it's actually disconnected these two joints. Basically just saying that joint 3 is no longer connected, or joint 4 is no longer connected to joint 3. So now it's its own little thing. I can move joint 4 around, it's still going to take everything under it. If I move joint 3, it's just sort of the end of the chain. It's kind of just going to hang out there. So if I wanted to rehook this up, I would just grab joint 4, throw it back under joint 3, and now you can see that it's sort of reconnected itself back up. You can also, if you wanted to, depending on what kind of skeleton you're making, I could take joint 4 and I could throw that under joint 2. Again, as soon as I do that, it's going to change the way that the joints are connected together. So now I can move joint 3 independently. Joint 4 still takes all the stuff with it. If I take joint 2, it's going to move joints 3 and 4 at the exact same time. So again, depending on the functionality you need, you can like set this up differently, but this is more or less the basics of how joints function and like move around. Any questions on this? Cool. All right. So really quick, I'm just going to show you guys how to set up more or less like the basic skeleton if you're going to make a human rig. It's like, it can be a little bit different for game stuff, but like the difference is negligible, honestly. Especially if you're making your custom skeletons, it doesn't really matter. If you're looking to set it to like a default character rig or whatever in Unity so you can reuse animations, you gotta do it like specifically, otherwise it doesn't really matter. So first thing I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna go into my skeleton menu again, create some more joints. So the first joint I'm gonna put in is gonna be kind of like towards the frontish of the pelvis. So I'm just going to dump that in and hit enter. And since there's no, additional joints in this chain, it's just basically just going to look like a little dot right now. So I'm going to select this. I'm going to call this my root joint. And I'm going to take this joint and duplicate it twice. So right now I have 3 joints sitting in the exact same spot. I'm not going to get super hardcore into why I'm doing this right now. Just this will set you up to have a nice, very functional rig should you choose to go forward with this and do actual animating stuff. So I'm going to call one of those duplicated joints spine 1 and the other one pelvis. So again, these are both just in the exact same position as my root joint. I'm going to take spine 1 and pelvis and middle mouse button drag them under root. So if I expand root, you can see that both of these are now under it. Wow, stop making joints. Alright. So that's, again, pretty much the basis of most human rigs. Next I'm going to do, throw in a leg joint. So again, skeleton, create joints. I'm going to pick an area that looks like it might be sort of in the center of like the hip leg-ish area. Pick somewhere basically if it was like a real body that you might expect the leg to sort of pivot from. So I'm just going to throw that little joint in there. Pick a space along that center line of the knee. So the little middle edge loop defining the curvature of the knee. Throw it a little bit towards the front of the knee, and then go back down and put another joint on the ankle and the ball of the foot. Ball of the foot's not really going to do anything because I don't have geometry there, but whatever. So once that's done, you can see we have, something that kind of resembles maybe like a little human leg skeleton kind of deal. If I look at my perspective mode, it's very much not attached to his leg, or like in either of his legs. Because again, since I made it in this side view, it's going to basically just throw it directly on that center plane. So I'm just going to take those joints and shift them over kind of to be centered in his leg-ish. So that actually does remind me, so the length of the joints is basically calculated through some like mathy stuff. So basically what it's doing is it's taking the translation of this first joint, and the second joint is basically how far away am I in local space from this last joint. So if you change the translates of any of these joints, it's actually going to change the length of the joints. So usually once you position your joints, wherever makes sense in your body for your rig, you don't mess with the translate, because again, that's actually going to change the shape of your joints. And the whole beauty of rigs is that you can sort of bend things in a way where it's fixed length. Like if I bend my shoulder, the distance between my shoulder and my elbow is not suddenly going to stretch longer or shorter. And rigging allows you to not have that weird stretching. So if you do need to actually move your rig around, you usually do that by controlling rotation. And strictly speaking, if you're animating on this, for the love of God, don't ever key like the rotation of these. It'll make you sad. I will just rotate joints and leave them for just posing stuff all the time, but never animate on joints. If you ever have me for animation classes, I will harp on that, and it'll totally make your life easier. But again, not super important right now. Mostly just remember, don't play with the translate, just rotate your joints if you need to move them. Make sense? Cool. All right. So I'm just going to run through with this little leg joint and call it, just go through and label things, hip. And for stuff where it's like you have, one arm, one leg on either side of your body, I will usually go through and label the joints left or right. It just helps keep things organized later. And as far as, how you decide to note left and right, doesn't really matter to me. Personally, I just like to say character's left is what I'm going to call the left leg, character's right is what I'm going to call right. I just think it's easy and uniform and just easy to deal with. But again, functionally doesn't really matter. So I'm going to take this hip joint, and I'm going to middle mouse button drag that under my pelvis. You can see that it's now sort of attached a little bone going out to that leg. So there's a few things, so not directly relating to rigging, but I do find it really annoying that I keep accidentally selecting this mesh. So I'm just going to run down here and make a display layer with a new object, what am I saying? Create a new layer and assign selected objects to it for my display layer. I'm just going to call this skin, brought it up on the other screen. And I'm just going to set the skin to reference so I don't keep accidentally selecting it because it's driving me nuts. And then I also do personally find it really hard to rig while in wireframe mode because the rigs pretty much just look like a wireframe. So if you want to work with your mesh shaded, in the viewport menus up here, you can go to shading, and if you check X-ray joints, it'll just pretty much show your joints through your model, which totally makes this easier to look at in my opinion. Again, functionally serves no purpose, just makes it a little easier to look at depending on your preferences. So right now, obviously, he only has one leg joint, which is, he has two legs, like he needs bones over here. So Maya has a really great feature where they actually allow you to mirror your joints over from one side to the other. And it's not, you don't do it with like the standard, you know, Control D to duplicate and then like drag it over or whatever. There's a special tool for it. So if you go into skeleton, mirror joints, and I'm going to open my tool settings. So usually for the mirror function, I sort of leave that as it is. And then mirror across is just asking which axis do you want to put this across. Honestly, I can literally never remember which one I'm supposed to use. So I usually just sort of click a thing and be like, that's clearly wrong. Maybe you try this one and be like, cool, that's the axis you need. So again, usually I will just go through and sort of randomly click one until it does what I want. It's kind of lazy, but it works. So what makes this really, really powerful and really, really nice, so you saw how I had to go through and like label everything like left hip, left knee, left ankle. If I just duplicated this, I would have to go through and rename everything right hip, right knee, right ankle. These little boxes let me do basically like a find and replace in Microsoft Word. So it's gonna, if you enter a particular string in here, in this case L underscore, it's gonna replace anything, anytime it finds this in the name of the joint, it's gonna replace that with whatever you wrote here. So if I wanted to be horrible, I could write beans, but I can't bring myself to leave it like that, so I'll just, you know, write R like a real person, and select my joint, and apply, and you can see that it's duplicated my joint chain, and also renamed everything so I don't need to do it manually. Which gets really nice if you're doing like tentacle arms or something, and you have like 30 joints, and you really don't want to go through and rename everything twice. So any questions about how we've gotten here? All right. I'm not going to go through like a bunch of crazy stuff with the upper body, but just like really quick for spine. So usually, again, you just sort of start with like doing a little bit of like the arch of the spine, and then once you hit like the bottom of the rib cage, so maybe around here, that doesn't really bend because your rib cage is there. So you can just pretty much throw a run joint from like the bottom of that rib cage up to your neck, and then you would, you know, throw in like a joint for the neck and then a head. And that's like more or less what you do for a spine chain. Go through and relabel these, like obviously like spine 2, oh god, what have I done? Rigging is just like a lot of renaming things. Chest joint, I usually just call the chest joint instead of spine 4. Again, personal preference. I just think it is a little bit easier to deal with. Alright. And as you might assume, I'm going to take spine 2 and put that under spine 1. So now I have, you know, something that's starting to look vaguely like a human skeleton, kind of. So the reason, so if you select root, this is just like a brief thing about why I did that thing with 3 joints at the beginning. I select root, it's going to drag all of my, like the top half of my body and the bottom half of the body all at the same time. But having those two joints allows me to rotate the spine from pretty much like the position of the root. And I can also make him do silly little dances by rotating his pelvis. So pretty much if I just had the hips under the root, and I wouldn't be able to rotate those separately and do that silly pelvis dance, because that would just take the rest of his body with it, if that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, honestly, like, don't super worry about it. It's more of like a down the road animation thing. Alright, so now we have this like very awkward little skeleton here, and he's like, I'm gonna do the can-can, but my body's not coming with me. That's awkward. So the way that you actually attach a mesh to a skeleton is called skin binding. Basically what it does, and I found this to be weirdly difficult to explain, but basically what it's doing is saying, for every vertex on the body, so like this vertex is like, cool, I'm gonna follow mostly this hip joint and maybe a little bit of this knee joint. Something up here is gonna be like, I'm gonna follow, or like this guy down here, I'm gonna follow mostly the knee and maybe a little bit of this like upper part of the body. It's basically just defining which joints each vertex is following, if that makes sense. If not, I'll just show you how to use it, and you can learn the concept later. Because, yeah, it's I don't know, kind of weird to explain. But either way, so I'm just going to grab my skin, and I'm going to select my root. I just shift selected that. And I'm going to go into skin, which is the menu directly to the right of skeleton, and open my bind skin menu. And this one I usually will actually look at the tool settings before I randomly hit apply. So there's two settings that I pay attention to most, and that is bind to and max influence. So bind to is basically asking, there's two options that I use in here. Joint hierarchy, which is saying, if I've selected one bone, in this case root, it's going to attach the skin to anything, any joint that is connected to root in any way. So it's going to go through like spine, pelvis, hips, legs, ankles, connect all of that stuff to my mesh. Which is usually what you're going to use if you are using some kind of organic character like this. Selected joints, as you might expect, is going to attach the skin only to the joints that you have selected. So in this case, like if I did selected my body and then selected like my pelvis and did and bound it like this, it would literally just attach this body to my pelvis. So it would move the entire body if I move the pelvis joint. It's going to be great. I'm going to do it really quick. Yay. And then like obviously like, so I'm moving his legs and nothing's happening. So again, in this case I actually want the skin bound to most of the joints. So I'm going to go joint hierarchy. Selected joints is good for stuff like eyeballs, where, you know, if you have a joint for an eye, your eye is going to follow that eye joint. Like if you bend your head, hopefully your eyes are not changing shape. Which happens all the time if I can't use selected joints. But anyway. So the only other thing that I usually pay attention to in here off the bat is max influences. This is basically how many joints are affecting a given vertex at a particular time. So I usually find, like 5 seems excessive to me. I usually just set it to 3, and then you can kind of like play with this later with your skin weights. And all of this stuff for like bind mode, skinning method, all this stuff, usually I only play with that. It's just different mathematical ways of calculating the skinning. And again, usually I'll only fiddle with that if there's something that's gone like horribly wrong with my original one. I'll just sort of like pick around at these settings and see if something does a little better. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply. And you can see that now if I move his pelvis, I mean, for some reason it's taking his arms with him. That's questionable, but it is at least, you know, deforming something in a way that looks a little bit more like a human body. So in this case, if I, you know, went in, holy crap, it actually did it almost not terribly for once. I'm actually kind of annoyed. That makes the demo harder. Alright, so if I like go in, there we go, and like bend his leg out, you'll notice that as I bend this left leg, it's taking half of his right leg with it. So I'm just going to run through real quick and also make another layer for my skeleton, because I deeply despise having to select around it. So I'm just going to reference that. So if you guys need to edit the way that this mesh is deforming, because like obviously this looks terrible on so many levels, you can right click on your mesh. Now that it's a skin, you should have this option for paint skin weights tool. So if you open that, it's going to bring up this little tool settings here. Basically what this is just, so here's a list of all of the joints you have. If you click on them, it's, you know, kind of changing the display a little bit. It's just showing you how much influence that particular selected joint has on all of the vertices around it. So that's, like, again, pretty much all this list is. Usually, I find it hard to look at in grayscale, so there's this little option for use color ramp down here under gradient. I'll check that on. I just think visually it makes it easier to see, like, so areas that are white are going to be, you know, pure influence of, like, I'm completely attached to the knee. As it gets to blue, it's going to be less and less influence, and then black is no influence. So again, I just think it's, like, easier to look at like this. Again, completely personal preference. So in this case, you can kind of see, any questions on anything up to this point? All right. So you can kind of see that, so I have the left knee selected, and you can see that, like, half of the right leg is highlighted, being like, so the right leg is being influenced by the left knee, which seems a little weird. To fix that, you basically are just going to want to go down and fiddle with the stuff kind of in the middle of the menu here. So paint operation, the only two that I really use frequently are replace and smooth. So replace is effectively, think of this as like drawing in Photoshop. Basically, if you're having like a brush and you're just like drawing over another color, that's basically what replace is. It's just sort of overriding whatever's below it. Smooth is going to do something a little bit more like, I guess, the smudge tool or like blending, but I'll kind of show you that in a sec. But I'm gonna stay with replace for now. Profile is like your brush profile. Again, think of this like Photoshop. So this guy here is pretty much a solid brush, like hard brush, no edge feathering. This guy is a very soft brush with a lot of edge feathering. Which one you use really depends on you and how you like to work. If you need a square, they have that. If for some reason you need to import an image file, they have that. I have literally never had to use that. Pretty much ignore these checkboxes. And then, so in this case, I'm just going to go to my hard brush, and I want to paint away all of this influence so that the left leg isn't abducting part of the right leg. So I'm just going to keep opacity at 1 and set my value at 0. 0 being have no influence on these vertices, 1 being have all of the influence. So I'm just going to go into my mesh, and you can see that as I draw along the vertices, it's getting rid of that influence, and my leg is sort of snapping back to where it should be. Obviously, it's still deforming a little weirdly up here, so I'm going to go and see, okay, so like my left hip has influence on my right leg. So again, I'm just going to go in, pretty much same brush settings, and just paint that away. And you can see that now my right leg is at least returned to something that looks kind of leg-ish, kind of. So I'm going to do the same thing for the left leg. I'm going to go through, click on the right knee, and be like, hey, right knee, don't influence the left leg, because that's ridiculous. Yay. And same thing with the knee, just kind of go through and get rid of stuff. Weight painting is like kind of tedious and boring, but look, now we have legs that kind of resemble legs still, kind of. If you want to, you could also go through and like do this on the arms, because for some reason the leg is like pushing the arm crazy far. Honestly, that's a new one. I've never seen the leg grab the arm before, but yeah, so that's, honestly, like that's more or less what weight painting is. Are there any questions just like basically on what it is or how to use it? All right. So again, that's more or less the thing where you would go back and just sort of, if your rig is making your model a little bit of a weird shape, you would just go in and play with the weights until you have like smoother transitions that are kind of more where you need them. And it actually occurred to me that I have completely forgotten to go over the assignment.